Welcome, everyone, one and all, to a new podcasting experience that you will never have heard in your entire lifetime. Well, technically, you never heard of this before, but this is something very new. Very excited for this one. In case you don't know, this is your boy, Kenneth the K-Rock Cline here, and you guys probably know me. I'm the co-host of the infamous, or I should say famous, Two Pals on a Pod podcast with my co-host, Mark T. Robinson, who, let's be realistic here, is the best co-host around, although he might say otherwise, but hey, we're both humble people. That's the way it's going to be. Folks, I've decided that while I enjoy doing that podcast, I feel like I need to branch out a little more. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I just want to feel like I'm doing something really cool, something spectacular. So I thought to myself, you know what? I have one podcast. Why not have a second podcast? But this time, it wouldn't necessarily feature my co-host, Mark T. Robinson. Nothing against him. It's just that I feel like I want to see if I can get this solo podcasting experience out of the way. So I thought, hey, why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's go ahead and try to come up with a second podcast. Let's see how this works out. And if it doesn't go well, then, hey, at least we got our old podcast back. But if this goes well, which I hope it does, it would definitely be the start of something spectacular, the start of something enjoyable for people to take some time off from their day work and just listen to your boy K-Rock give you his thoughts on certain subjects. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it gives me great joy and pleasure to introduce to you the new podcast that I am about to be hosting myself. It is officially called Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with the K-Rock. Yes, Krocking, Locking, and Dropping. Where the heck did I come up with that name, you say? Well, if you go to my Instagram account, it's Crock, Lock, and Drop It. That's where you can follow me on Instagram. I also have a Twitter account, KRock1991. You can also follow me there. Although I will admit, I may not be able to accept you guys on the way, but as long as you message me or do anything, just to let me know that, hey, you're a big fan of mine, and you hope that we can connect, and hopefully I can build some good relationships out of everybody that I get in contact with at certain points as well. But before we get into the premise of this podcast, allow me to introduce myself for those of you that may not know me or may not be familiar with my other podcasts. My name is Kenneth Cline. I am currently 33 years old, although age doesn't really matter as much as it is just a number. And I currently work as a assistant director of sports information. I always get this confused. I always get my job title confused, but it's actually the assistant director of media relations at Lamar University here in Beaumont, Texas. Now, originally, I am a Houston native, so I am from Houston, Texas, and I always consider it my home, and I hope one day to return back to Houston, because I know there are a lot of exciting things going on down there, and I don't want to miss out on the fun. But right now, I'm currently in Beaumont, Texas, working at Lamar University, an NCAA D1 university. So most of the time, I'm really busy with a lot of things down there, covering our sports teams and, doing all the home games, the recaps, and just writing previews and, all that stuff. As a matter of fact, we're actually about a couple weeks away from having our annual awards show. We call it the Cardinal Choice Awards. So that's definitely going to be real fun. So I am kind of a little bit busy, but I hope to make time for y'all to give you my thoughts on certain subjects and certain things and certain areas that I hope you guys get a chance to listen in and maybe pitch in a few comments as well. We're going to be starting things off. I'm going to be putting this on my YouTube channel, which hopefully, we'll get something going and get a lot of feedback and views and some comments as well. And then hopefully, if this continues to go well, I'll be able to branch out and put it on some podcasts, whether it be on Buzzsprout, Spotify, and all that. So yeah, it's definitely something that I've I've been thinking about recently. And hopefully, this goes really well. So I hope that we get an opportunity to get started with something new and something exciting, really, which hopefully goes really, really well. I apologize if I get a little tongue-tied here, because I am a little nervous. This is the first time I'm doing a solo podcast. I'm used to having a co-host with me, just somebody to talk to. But yeah, I figured I'd give this a go ahead, and we'll see how this goes as well. So yeah, I got a couple of subjects I want to talk to you about today. But first and foremost, I figured what better way to get to know us better than to have a random question of the day. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this website on here, and I'm going to basically ask, get a random question generator, and then I'm going to generate a question. It's going to ask me a question, and I'm going to answer it. This is kind of an opportunity for y'all to get to know me as well, and a lot of things. So, all right, here we go. The question of the day is, what's your go-to dance move? Well, I will admit, I'm really not much of a dancer, but years ago when I was in middle school, I created this dance move. I called it the Mo. And basically what it is you get on the floor and you try to circle around. It's almost like you're kind of breakdancing on the floor, but you use your legs and move around in a circle, kind of like a Mo digging out from the ground and everything. So I don't know where I came up with that or what was the source of inspiration. Maybe I was watching some old classic Three Stooges movie to get that source of inspiration, but I thought it was really cool, so I used to do it as well. I don't do it anymore because I'm a little older, and I look back at my times in elementary, middle school with a little bit of embarrassment. So that's kind of the way I like to think back to my time as a youngster as well. So anyway, that's the random question generator, the question of the day. Hopefully we'll have more of these in the next coming future as well. So I want to talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind recently. And the first thing I want to talk about is, as I said, I'm a Houston guy. So yes, I am a Houston sports fan. And, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this situation, and I was starting to wonder, the landscape of the Houston sports scene may be changing as we know it. What do I mean by that? Well, the last 7 years or so, there's only been one team that has really dominated the city, and that, of course, has been the Houston Astros. I mean, and who can blame them? 4 World Series appearances, 2 World Series championships. Yes, 2 World Series championships, folks. And, of course, that should put them in a category as being a dynasty. I certainly think they are a dynasty. I'm not a huge fan of having teams win 3 championships in a short period of time. I think if you dominate your sport for a long time and you win a couple of championships, then you should be considered a dynasty. Now, sometimes I might have a few exceptions to that dynasty rule as well, but that's for a story for another time. But yeah, so basically in Houston, there's only been one team that's been dominating, and that, of course, has been the Astros. For the last 7 years, they have been the best team in Houston, and one of the best teams, not just in baseball, but in all of sports as well. Whereas the Rockets and the Texans have, let's just say, they haven't really lived up to expectations. There's just been a lot of suffering and struggles for those franchises as well, and conflicts, which I'll get to more in just a moment, but it's just safe to say that those two teams haven't brought as much excitement as the Astros have been. But then, this past year, something unique has happened. Sure, the Astros had another great season. They reached the ALCS, unfortunately losing in 7 games to the bitter rival Texas Rangers, which I hope will get another opportunity to get y'all and beat y'all in the playoffs as well. But not only that, the Texans and the Rockets both had really good seasons. You think back to everything that has happened in the landscape of Houston for the past few years. As I said, the Texans and the Rockets have been teams that have struggled for the last couple of seasons as well. But for some reason, the Texans in 1 year went from being cellar dwellers to all of a sudden playoff contenders, and now with the offseason that they've had, they've become legitimate AFC title contenders? Maybe Super Bowl contenders? After 1 season? Are you kidding me? Holy tornado, that is really, really exciting. And you think back to everything that franchise had gone through. For starters, the Texans had fired their previous head coach, Lovie Smith. Now, this was, of course, a bit of a recurring pattern for the team because the Texans had 4 head coaches in the past 4 seasons, not including this last season. But Bill O'Brien was there for most of the season. He started 0-4 in 2020, and then he got fired. Romeo Crennel took over as the interim head coach of the team and finished out the season where they went 4-12. Then the Texans hired David Culley, who had never been a head coach at any point in his NFL career, even though it was a big deal because it was the first time ever that a black head coach coached the Houston Texans. So I took that as a level of respect, but that did not quite work out as hoped, as the Texans had another 4-win season. So then they fired David Culley, and the Texans were trying to figure out they were trying to figure out who to hire for their new head coach, and there was a lot of chaos in that because the Texans really didn't do a great job with the coaching process or the interview process to get a coach. And ultimately, at the last minute, they decided to promote defensive coordinator Lovie Smith, who had previously been with the Chicago Bears, led them to a Super Bowl appearance with the worst quarterback to ever play in a Super Bowl, I might add, with Rex Grossman. Chicago Bear fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about as well. But Lovie Smith was there, the head coach, and yeah, he had coached also with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as well. So there was a lot of I wouldn't say there was a lot of excitement. There was a little bit sense of relief because it seemed like Lovie Smith was more of a safe choice, but someone that had really done a great job of turning the defense around a bit. So maybe you're thinking, okay, he's going to turn the program around and be back to mediocre at best. Well, the Texans ended up going 3-13-1 with the one tie being the first game of the year where they blew a 20-0 lead against the Indianapolis Colts. Ironically, the last game of the season was against the Indianapolis Colts, and that was a game where if the Texans lost, they would have had the number 1 draft pick, and they would have had the number 1 draft pick, and the Chicago Bears, the team that they were competing with for the number 1 pick, would have had the number 2 pick as well. So all the Texans had to do was lose to the Indianapolis Colts, and they would get the number 1 pick. Well, Lovie Smith probably knew that his time was up as head coach of the Texans, and he decides that he's going to go for the win. They were down by 7 points. They completed 2 fourth-down Hail Marys, and the second one was caught for a touchdown. Then they chose to go for 2, and they got it. Texans won the game 32-31, but it was like, why do you need to win that game? You had the chance to get the number 1 draft pick. So unfortunately, the Texans ended up losing the number 1 draft pick, and they got number 2, and everyone was kind of in a panic mode because the Texans, again, finding a way to screw things around. But sometimes the worst case scenario actually turns out to be the best case scenario because things have happened for the Texans that have been a bright spark for them. First thing, they hired D'Amico Ryans as their head coach, and D'Amico Ryans was a former Texans player who had a great career here in Houston, Rookie of the Year, team captain, a bit of a Pro Bowler, but he had been in the coaching ranks, first with the Philadelphia Eagles and then with the 49ers as defensive coordinator, so he had been a hot commodity in the coaching scheme, and it seemed like D'Amico Ryans was interested in rejoining the Texans and being a head coach, and sure enough, Cal McNair and Nick Caserio pulled the trigger and said, all right, D'Amico Ryans, you are the head coach of the Houston Texans, and that got a lot of fans excited. But that was only in the month of January, I believe, either January or February. A couple of months later, the NFL draft happened, so the Texans had the number 2 pick. Well, actually, they had 2 first-round picks. They had one at number 2, and they had one at number 12. So there was a lot of question as to what the Texans were going to do, since by this point it became apparent that the Carolina Panthers, the team that had traded up with the Chicago Bears to get the number 1 pick, were going to take Bryce Young. And the Panthers took Bryce Young, and the Texans were stuck with a couple of players. But then, in a shocking move, the Texans drafted C.J. Stroud at number 2, and then they drafted Will Anderson. Well, technically they traded up to number 3 to get Will Anderson with the number 3 spot. And just like that, the Texans got the future offensive rookie of the year and the future defensive rookie of the year on the same team, in the same draft, side by side. That's a historic draft, if you ask me. I mean, there are not many teams that are able to hit home runs in one pick, let alone 2 in back-to-back. Now, I call these home runs because they both had home run seasons, but it's still possible that both of these players may not turn out to be what fans hope they would. But obviously, with what happened this past season where the Texans, they win the AFC South division. Now, some will say, well, the Jaguars blew it because the Jaguars were 8-3, and the Texans came back and were able to win the games that they needed to. But look, the Texans won a division when a year ago they were the worst team in all of professional football. And then they go out and they beat the Cleveland Browns in a 45-14 trouncing. The Browns entered that game with the best defense in all of the NFL, and yet C.J. Stroud picked them apart like he was a veteran. Houston goes on to the divisional round, but unfortunately their season came to an end with a loss to the Baltimore Ravens. So, now what? Well, the Texans, who won the NFL draft this past season, have actually won the NFL free agency period up to this point. Because when you look at all the names of the teams that they were competing against for big name players, guys like Saquon Barkley was a major player, someone that could have been a huge asset to the team since the Texans needed a running game because they had lost Devin Singletary, who was their running back previously, and Dameon Pierce, who was the great rookie running back. He didn't really have a great sophomore year, so they were hoping to build up in the running game, and they didn't get Saquon Barkley, even though Barkley had tremendous interest in joining the Texans. However, Houston traded up with the Bengals to acquire Joe Mixon, who was on Joe Burrow's team in Cincinnati back in 2021 when the Bengals went to the Super Bowl. So you get Joe Mixon, a talented running back. Then you add a couple of free agents on the defensive side, one from Tennessee, and then, of course, the biggest one being Danielle Hunter from the Minnesota Vikings, who is a Houston guy, and he's probably one of the most underrated defensive players in all of the NFL. Like, you think about the great defensive players, Micah Parsons comes to mind, TJ Watt, another great player, but Danielle Hunter, that's a guy that doesn't get as much credit as he probably should. And yet here he is, he's being paired up with Will Anderson Jr. to form potentially one of the best defensive linebacking corps in all of the NFL. But then, about a week or so ago, Houston pulled off another stunning trade. They acquired Stephon Diggs, former wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. And yes, there had been a lot of issues with him in Buffalo regarding he wasn't getting that many touches and everything. But you're talking about a guy that has been considered one of the best wide receivers in all of the game. Now, I'm not saying he'll be at his prime when he joins the Texans, and certainly there's going to be a lot of questions regarding whether or not he can coexist with C.J. Stroud after there were some issues with him and Josh Allen, and then the same issues going all the way back to when he was with the Minnesota Vikings. But for a guy that comes in, he's already part of a wide receiving core with Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and a couple of other guys, Xavier Hutchinson, another player on the squad of the team that I can think of at the moment. This is a guy that really has made the Texans potentially into AFC contenders. And it's surprising when you think about it that way, because the Texans reached the AFC divisional playoff round, but all of a sudden you have some people saying, well, this team is destined to win the AFC championship game. They're going to try to beat the Kansas City Chiefs and everything. And you're just like, holy, you got to pump the brakes on it a little bit, because obviously, on paper, there's no question the Texans are one of the best teams in all of the AFC, let alone the NFL, with the players they have right now. But you got to go out and play. This team could potentially, go out there and they may struggle. That just happens. It's hard to be consistent in the NFL. It's hard to be consistent in any sports season for that matter. You have to have a lot of things go right for you. And this would definitely be a major test for the Houston Texans as they get set to, potentially take the field in August or so. I know they started their OTAs and the off-season workouts and everything, but, they're going to be a threat to watch. And that's definitely something that a lot of people will have to take care of business. So you have the Texans with their situation. Now you have the Rockets, who made big news at the start of last season when they hired Ime Udoka, if I get that name incorrectly pronounced, I apologize. But Udoka, who was a former head coach of the Boston Celtics, had guided them to the 2022 NBA Finals, but was then fired because of some internal crisis, an internal situation, which I'm not going to go much into details, but it's one of the most complicated scandals I've ever heard about in all the NBA, let alone in all of sports. But it definitely ended his tenure there in Boston, and he was not able to coach this past season. But he gets hired by the Rockets, and here was a Rockets team that they had a lot of young talent. They had a lot of young, great players, but the thing that they were lacking was a direction to go into. And this was a team that, seemed like they weren't going in any direction, trying to figure out, what's the best way to handle this. Because they had Steven Silas, who was their head coach, and in all fairness to him, and with all due respect to him, he wasn't the coach that was going to get that team closer and closer to the playoffs. But you had Jalen Green, a Rockets player, who was pretty inconsistent for most of his career. Here he was making he would have some moments where he would put up 30, 40 points a night, and then he would kind of struggle in a bit. But this past season, I really saw Jalen Green step up. And there was a period in the month of March where you can honestly say that Jalen Green was the best player in the NBA. Over the last couple of weeks and couple of months, Jalen Green was just playing lights-out basketball, and there was a period where, at first, the Rockets kind of started off the season, they were kind of okay, so-and-so, but then they kind of made things interesting where, before you know it, the Rockets were actually in a playoff team by December and early January, and you're thinking to yourself, this Rockets team could actually surprise everyone and make some noise. But then they go through a little bit of a low, they struggle, they lose some games, and next thing you know, they're out of the playoff picture, the play-in picture, I probably should say. And it looked like this was just going to be another young team that all you really care about is them finishing the season and them continuing to develop. Well, the Rockets end up winning putting up 12 consecutive victories in a row, and that made everybody really surprised because at one point, the Rockets were actually the number 11 seed, and they were a game behind the Golden State Warriors, who were sliding. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is great. The Rockets are one game back of Golden State. They actually have a chance to knock off Golden State, who had beaten them 4 times in the playoffs. This is exciting. This is great. This is just like watching a baseball pennant race come down to the wire. Well, needless to say, the Rockets got a little bit of humility when they lost to Golden State, and then they lost a couple more games, which unfortunately ended their chances of making it to the play-in game. But I saw a stat that I thought was real interesting. The Rockets finished 41-41, a .500 record. That is the best record by any 11th seeded team since, I guess, the NBA started their play-in tournament a few years back, or ever in the history of the NBA, because a lot of teams in each conference finished 11 seeds. And I think that just comes to show you how tough the Western Conference is. Like last year, you can say they took a little bit of a bye year, for that matter, and ended up with Denver winning the championship, whereas the Eastern Conference was really loaded and stacked with talent. But it seems like all is right in the world, and the Western Conference is stacked and talented as well. Now, unfortunately for Houston, they're going to have to watch the playoffs from the couch, but they have to have the sense that they're getting better as a team, and next year should be the year where they make at least the play-in. So they should be a fun team to watch for the next season or so. And if you're a Rockets fan, you have to be feeling very confident about next year's squad. Obviously, Jalen Green is playing lights out, but Alperen Şengün, he was really the best player early on in the season, but then he kind of got hurt, and he just never was able to get back on the court, which, to be fair, the Rockets really didn't need him because they were playing so well. But Fred VanVleet was having an outstanding stretch after he signed with Houston. Then you had Jabari Smith, who stepped up in some big-time moments as well. I mean, this Rockets team really surprised everybody, and they really made this past season fun to watch, even though they didn't make the playoffs, which is disappointing, and you have to watch the Dallas Mavericks take over as the lone Texas team. And the Mavericks have a really good team to watch in the Western Conference of the playoffs as well. I think they'll make it as far to maybe the conference finals, but if they run into Denver, that's where it gets very, very interesting. So, having said all that, this past season, you can argue, was the season of the Rockets and the Texans. And that leads me to this question. Has the power shift in Houston changed? Because right now, the Astros are the only team that's going on right now until August, and they're not having a good start to their season. I'll just be honest. I mean, look, I know it, and it's frustrating to watch, but they're not having a good start to their season. And this is something that fans in Houston are not accustomed to unless you had been around in the 2011-2013 seasons where the team lost 3 consecutive 100-loss seasons. My brother, Andrew, would attest to that, because he would always go to those games, and he would always find fun things to do, try to be the source of entertainment on a night when the Astros were getting beat really badly, just for the fun of it. But, he's a great guy. But, yeah, he would always go to those games as well. But it's kind of one of those cases where you think back to where the landscape of Houston was in the 2020s, in the early 2020s. I know in 2020 it was a very dark year for the city to be a sports fan because you had the whole Astros and the sign stealing situation, which I will say to this day, it would not have made a difference. Even whether or not they took signs, which I know they did, but whether or not they used it or they played regularly, they still would have won that championship regardless. They just didn't need to do that. But you had all that and the after effect. You had the Texans' massive situation where they traded DeAndre Hopkins. Then the Deshaun Watson saga with all the sexual misconduct allegations, which I believe there were 24 of them, which is a high number. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then, the fact that he wasn't going to play for the Texans because, he didn't get the head coach that he wanted, and then he didn't get the general manager that he wanted. He thought, he signed a 4-year contract. Why would you sign a 4-year contract and then all of a sudden say, I'm out of here. I don't want to play here, this and that, because I'm not getting things my way. Dude, you really hadn't done much when you played for the Texans. Yes, you got us to the playoffs, and you got us a quarter and a half ahead of the Kansas City Chiefs, up 24-0 before everything happened. Patrick Mahomes deserves more ownership of the Kansas City Chiefs than you did with the Houston Texans. Now, I don't know if Mahomes would ever consider taking ownership of the Kansas City Chiefs. But that would be my assumption based on the way, their careers have gone up to this point. But you had the Deshaun Watson saga and the 3 losing seasons for the Texans. And then the James Harden mess when early on Stephen Silas was hired to coach both Russell Westbrook and James Harden. But Russell Westbrook ended up getting traded to Washington in return for John Wall. And then about a month into the season, James Harden, who just decided he just quit on the team, which to this day, I don't care how much of a fan you were of James Harden. I don't care how much you supported the guy, loved the guy, and you still respect the guy, James Harden should not have his jersey number retired in Houston. I mean, that's basically my unpopular opinion right there. I may use that unpopular opinion for my other podcast, but I don't think he deserves to have that because of the way he exited. And in some ways, his career has kind of been karmatic because he joins the Brooklyn Nets to try to win a championship with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and that failed miserably. He then goes to the Philadelphia 76ers, tries to win with Joel Embiid. That doesn't go well. And now he's with the Los Angeles Clippers, who, golly, I don't know. Like, I just don't see how the Clippers are going to do much in the playoffs this year. Like, James Harden has ruined his reputation. He's a talented, great scorer. He can definitely score 60 points depending on how you want, and even if it means drawing some pointless fouls from the NBA. But when it comes to the way he controls his career, the way he sees fit, nobody in the NBA should want to take James Harden at this point. The Clippers should be the last team he plays for. Unless there's a team in Europe or in China or wherever that is willing to let him play there. But James Harden has definitely ruined his reputation. So because of that, Harden goes to the Nets, and the Nets give the Rockets a ton of boatload of picks. But it was a very tough stretch to be a Houston fan in the early 2020s. Now, I know you'll remember 2020 for the COVID-19 situation, the race riots, the protests, and the unfortunate passing of Kobe Bryant, but it was a dark period. But one thing that was certain was that at that stage in Houston sports, it was the Astros first, the Rockets and the Texans both battling for second place as far as the big three. Now, I know the Dynamo and the Houston Dash were there as well, and I know the Houston Dash had a successful championship run, and the Dynamo, I think they won some kind of tournament recently, but we're talking about the big three of the pro Big Four sports, which hopefully Houston gets a hockey team real soon. But you think back to everything that happened in that time, where it was a real tough period to be a Houston fan. But you knew that regardless, your best chance of winning a championship was with the Astros. Despite all they had to endure, from the booing to the criticisms of the fans, they continued to fight back, and they continued to take the punches and show everyone that they could win. And they got back to the World Series once, and they got back to the World Series twice, and they won that World Series. They've been to 7 straight ALCSs, and that is a remarkable achievement to get to the ALCS and then win 4 AL pennants out of that. That's like the Cleveland Browns in the early 50s making it to 10 straight NFL championship games. That's like the Atlanta Braves from the 1990s making it to 8 straight NLCSs. Or the New England Patriots going to 8 straight AFC championship games. Or LeBron James making it to the NBA Finals in every year in the 2010s, except for 2019, but that was a different story. But that team, the Astros, really carried the city, and they carried the franchise. And they carried the honor of the sports city to prove to Houston that it can fight back, and it still fights back. It still feels like it's Houston against everybody. But now, right now, they're kind of at a little bit of a slow start, which at this point in this podcast, they are currently 6-12, which is not the record that I definitely would have envisioned them starting off, even though I knew this first month was going to be a little bit of a struggle because the starting pitching is a bit of a struggle. They don't really have the full-scale guys on the squad at this point, but hopefully that changes and when they get everybody back healthy soon. But you don't want to get off to a slow start like that. I mean, starting off 6-12 is absolutely ridiculous. Now, I did do a little research, and one team that I know that started this bad but had a strong finish was the Anaheim Angels back in 2002. They won the World Series in 2002 when they started 6-14 and went all the way to take the championship. Now, they were the wild card team that year, which, okay, you still got to the playoffs, and that's good. But they got hot at the right time, and they went on to win the whole thing. So it's still possible that the Stros can turn this around and they could still make a run to the ALCS and maybe to another World Series, which would really help. I still say they're a dynasty, but adding a third championship would add an element or elevate their dynasty to a whole nother stratosphere. And look, if they don't get it this year, then hopefully they get it next year, even though there's going to be some issues with contracts and potentially losing some valued players on your squad. You're still trying to develop the guys that you have on the team. But right now, when I'm looking around the Houston landscape, I notice that there are more people that are very excited for the Houston Texans. And for good reason. You're coming off the best season, well, a very enjoyable season. You made your first playoff in 4 years. You have potentially have a franchise quarterback who won Rookie of the Year. You have a great defensive player, a rookie staff, a great head coach, and you added these veteran players in free agency. All of a sudden, you're talking about being potentially a top 5, top 3 AFC caliber team that has a chance to do something good against the Kansas City Chiefs and against the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens, who, yes, I know the Ravens beat the Texans badly, 34-10. But there's a lot of excitement. And it's not just the fans that are saying that. It's the national media. Like, can you believe everybody in the national media is giving Houston a level of respect? Because 3 years ago, the Texans wouldn't be getting this kind of hype. They would be getting criticized and vilified for everything that was going on, and rightfully so. But, holy moly. You know, you're seeing all these people talking about the Texans and how they're potentially the team that can do so much. And yet there's even been talk about who's been the best team in Texas, the Texans or the Cowboys. And, well, I got to be honest with you. I know the Cowboys have been to the playoffs, but what have they really done in the playoffs? Nothing. And when you say that you're going all in and you don't do anything, that puts into question the validity of your statement, Jerry Jones, because the Texans didn't say we're going all in. They made that statement with all these acquisitions that they're going all in. And they know that after 3 more years of C.J. Stroud, you're going to have to pay him a ton of money, which could potentially be a significant issue. So why not just go ahead and fill him around with talent with the 3 years you have left on his contract? There's definitely a level of excitement among the fans because, look, the Rockets have won their championships. The Astros have won their championships. The Texans haven't even been to an AFC championship game, let alone a Super Bowl. Houston has yet to win a Super Bowl. They've yet to make a Super Bowl. They've hosted a Super Bowl. They've hosted, I want to say, 3 Super Bowls, 2 of them involving Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. But we're talking about getting to the big game, which, in my opinion, I think is going to happen. Now, I don't think it will be this year because you just don't really know how you compare with the Kansas City Chiefs, who are currently the best team in the AFC. You don't know how you stand up with the Cincinnati Bengals or the Baltimore Ravens or the Buffalo Bills. And you're going to find out because next year you're playing a first-place schedule. Last year the Texans had a 4th-place schedule, but nobody thought that they were going to finish 10-7. And now you're playing a first-place schedule, which is definitely harder than last year. And people are expecting the Texans to go 12-5 or 13-4, AFC South champions, you know. And that there's just so much question marks regarding that. But I feel like there's more people that are very excited over the fact that the city is now turning into a football town, even though the best team in these past 7 years have been on the baseball field. And listen, everything, it's great. I think this is great for the city of Houston because now when one team struggles, another team is starting to take hold, and you don't need to wait for a long time before there's a team that can win a championship or potentially win a championship for that matter. What the Astros have done over the past 7 years will always be grateful. My brother says that this is the best run of any Houston sports team ever, and I sometimes cringe when I say that because I know the ramifications of everything that happened in that first championship. But to this day, I still say that it wouldn't have made much of a difference anyway. Yet, right now, it seems like the momentum is shifting towards the Texans being the top team in the city, or the Rockets potentially being there. Now, I don't know if the Rockets will be in first place after next year, but you got a lot of people excited for the Texans. And then with the Rockets, with what they've done, there's a potential that that team will make the playoffs the very next year. So you have a lot of excitement going on in Houston. The dark days of 2020 are dead, buried. We no longer have to feel disappointed where we would be the city that sold our soul to the devil. We no longer have to feel that way. We have a reason to be excited. And I know it's bad right now because the Astros are not getting it together, but I still have confidence that they can turn it around. Hell, when the Astros were 15-30 in 2005, I had a feeling they were going to turn it around, and guess what they did? They made the World Series. They lost to the White Sox, yes, but they still made the World Series. That was a big deal. There's a reason to be excited. And I truly believe that the city of Houston is destined to have another team be as successful. I don't know if the Texans will have an Astros-like run or will be like the Rockets of the 1990s when they won back-to-back championships. But I feel like there is a lot of optimism to be a Texans fan at this point. You know, it's been since 2012, I want to say, or 2013, when I feel like a lot of fans were more excited to be Texans fans than previously before. But this is really the ultimate high. Because right now, the Texans have arguably a top 5 quarterback. And I know I've said that a couple of times. They have an outstanding rookie head coach who, you read the interviews of all the players, they talk about the impact that DeMeco Ryans has. He's changed the culture. It was a bad culture before he got there, but he's changed the culture. And next thing you know, you're having all these players coming up to Will Anderson Jr. and saying, "Hey, man, I want to join the Texans. You know, I want to play for y'all, man. This is that, you know, blah, blah, blah." And Will Anderson's like, whoa, whoa. It's not for everybody because you have to follow a certain code to be a Texan. And he's right because the culture is exciting, but it's not for everybody. And certainly we're going to find out if this culture is an ideal fit for Stephon Diggs, given everything that he's had to endure in Buffalo and in Minnesota. Some people are not fans of that move. I personally am a fan of that move, and I'm certainly grateful or glad that the Texans decided to void the last 3 years of his contract because, again, the Texans obviously know that it puts the expectation, it puts the pressure on Diggs to perform up to his standards, to say, look, man, you need to earn this. You need to earn the right to play and to be paid to increase your value. Because right now, your reputation, it's not a good one. So it does put the pressure on Stephon Diggs. Certainly, you have to hope that he can gel with his teammates and accept the fact that, you know, he may not be as a prime receiver as he was in the past few years. But I think back to everything that has happened with the Texans, and I feel like this is the right time for them to step up and be a true contender. I respect the Kansas City Chiefs. I have a cousin who's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. I respect them a lot. But my dream would be to see us beat them in a playoff game, hosting in Houston, I might add, and to go to the Super Bowl. And hopefully I am there at that game. I hope so. Because I feel like this city has waited a long time to go to a Super Bowl. Same thing with Detroit. Same thing with Cleveland. Same thing with Jacksonville. I mean, I feel like there's a power shift going in Houston. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing for the Astros? No. Because I feel like every one of the teams support each other and they want to see everyone win. But I feel like if the Stros want to retain some of their swagger, some of their confidence to get themselves going, to continue to elevate their dynasty status, now's the perfect time to start winning games. And look, the first month of the schedule is a tough month, but you don't want to start off as badly as this. If it doesn't work out for them this year, I don't think it'll be the end of the run, but certainly I think this could be a situation where they might have to kind of reset, regroup, and everything, and then hopefully after a while build off and put together a new team and just say, you know what, we're going to rebuild, we're going to try again at some point, and hopefully we'll get a run to put together playoff teams to potentially win another championship, because I feel like the city is deserving at least 3. This is really an interesting time to be a Houston sports fan, because all the times from April to October and to November, you knew the Stros were going to give you some entertainment. You didn't have that confidence in the Rockets and the Texans because they were struggling. From November until March, you were waiting and craving for the Stros to take the field. But now, it's completely different. It seems as if the Texans and the Rockets are starting to shift the power of it to Houston in their favor. Does it mean that it's their town now? No. But is it their town eventually? Potentially. I think the Texans will have a great season next year. I think the Rockets will have a great season next year. I'm not giving up on the Stros yet, but I do think that they're at the start of the end of this grand run, which may never happen again. And you hope that it happens again to where they win another championship. But right now, there does seem to be a little bit of that momentum shift towards the Texans and the Rockets. And I think that's a good thing if you're a Houstonian, because you don't have to wait and suffer for a long time, because potentially you have 3 teams that can contend for championships. And as far as I'm concerned, I think it's time we prove to Dallas that they're not the only ones that can win around here. San Antonio, okay, yeah, they won 5 championships, but they got the Spurs. Let's be realistic here. There's really 2 dominant sports cities. And I think Houstonians don't want to be the second sports city for too long. That's just the way I look at it at this point. So, yeah, that's basically my thoughts on the landscape of Houston sports at this time. That's going to conclude the first episode of, of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with K-Rock here. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And hopefully next time I have a topic that is of good conversation, and potentially we'll get into more topics over the years and do some more fun stuff. But again, you guys can like this if you want, and feel free to comment, leave feedback, and just give me some tips on how I can better myself at this. And again, keep looking out for the podcast 2 Pals on a Pod with Mark T. Robinson and myself, and we'll be on Spotify, Buzzsprout, and Apple iTunes podcasts as well. So again, guys, hope you guys have a great time, and we will see you next time on this version of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with K-Rock.